In 1918, the end of World War I was in sight. The tired and hungry Germans were exhausted after fighting for long years. And although they had dealt some serious blows to the Allies recently, the truth is that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. But that doesn't mean that Germany was totally incapable of winning the war. In fact, things were actually going very well for them at this point. Their army was undefeated since the British had taken control of the seas. Germany's enemies could not reinforce their Western Front troops, nor could they launch any sort of meaningful counteroffensive. This allowed the Germans to dictate the terms on the Western Front, slowly but surely wearing down the enemy. So what if Germany had been able to capitalize on this opportunity and win the Great War? Let's find out. As always, this is just a fun exploration of an alternate history. It's not meant to be taken seriously, and it's certainly not an indicator of my stance on the subject of World War I. With that being said, let's begin. By late 1918, the British and French colonies all across the world were rising up against their imperial masters. There were mutinies in the ranks of the British Navy, while entire French divisions refused to go back into battle. At this point, it seemed as if even victory would bring about the collapse of the British and French empires. The situation was more dire in Russia. After the Bolsheviks took power and pulled the nation out of World War I, the Germans had pushed deep into the collapsing Russian Empire. As we all know, Ukraine was in turmoil at this very time. People were starving by the millions, and it looked as if the nation could collapse into chaos and civil war. For the Central Powers, this situation was like a dream come true. Not only did it mean that they no longer had to worry about the Russian threat, but it also freed up hundreds of thousands of troops who could now be used to fight on the Western Front. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was also doing quite well. They had proven to be a tough nut to crack for the British and their allies, and it seemed as if they would survive the war with minimal territorial losses. The Austro-Hungarians were also doing well. After a shaky start to the war, they had managed to hold their own on the Italian front, and it seemed as if they too would emerge victorious. All of this is to say that when the armistice was eventually signed, it was looking more likely than ever that the Central Powers would prevail. However, despite these victories on the periphery, the Germans were still losing the war. The British blockade had cut off all trade with the outside world, meaning that Germany would soon run out of raw materials. By November 1918, food shortages were so widespread that even the German generals realized that Ludendorff's plan to fight until the end would spell certain doom for the nation. On October, a group of German leaders met together in order to discuss the possibility of ending the war on favorable terms. The meeting was kept secret from Ludendorff, and the Kaiser was furious when he found out. Nonetheless, this meeting marked the beginning of the end for Germany's involvement in World War I. But what if this hadn't happened? What if the Kaiser and his generals had ignored the pleas of the civilian leaders and continued to fight? Well, in that case, it's entirely possible that Germany would have won the war. First of all, Ludendorff had already managed to force the Allies into a stalemate on the Western Front. If the fighting had dragged on for another year or two, it's entirely possible that the Germans could have worn down the enemy enough to achieve a decisive victory. Just imagine what would have happened if the Kaiser had somehow managed to push the British and French back across the Channel. With the rest of Europe under the control of the Central Powers, Germany would have been in a position to dictate peace terms to the remaining allies. Austria would have been able to regain all of its lost territories, while Germany would have emerged as the undisputed power in Europe. The Japanese wouldn't stand for this, however. As soon as Germany started winning, they would almost certainly invade mainland China. In an attempt to cripple Japan's war effort, the German army would then make their way through the Middle East, conquering everything in their path. With the British Empire destroyed and the U.S. still isolationist, the Germans would then turn their attention to South America. After easily defeating the weak Brazilian forces, the Germans would march north, conquering Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola. Soon, the entire Western Hemisphere would be under German control. Of course, this scenario is pure fantasy. Even if Germany had won the war, there's no way that they would have been able to conquer the other continents. But what if the Germans had somehow managed to do this? If the Germans had somehow managed to conquer the Americas, as well as most of Asia and Africa, they would have built the largest empire in the history of mankind. Some might even call it a German New World Order. Now let's look at another possibility. Let's say that the Kaiser had listened to his civilian leaders and decided to end the war on favorable terms. How would this have changed the outcome of the 20th century? After ending the war with the Allies, the Germans would have been in a strong position to dominate Europe. They would have likely enforced this dominance by forming a powerful alliance with Austria, Hungary, which would effectively surround France with German-speaking nations. This alliance would have lasted until the end of World War II. While this alliance would have been a constant thorn in the side of the French, it's unlikely that the Germans would have attempted to conquer them, given how badly the previous invasion had gone. Instead, the Germans would likely have focused on building their empire in Africa. After successfully colonizing the Congo and pushing the British back in South Africa, the Germans would have built a vast colonial empire that would rival that of the British. During the interwar period, the Germans would have tried to build their nation up in preparation for the inevitable conflict with Britain, while the French would have likely remained neutral. The Austrians would have sided with the Germans due to their desire to crush Slavic nationalism once and for all. When World War II finally broke out, the British would have been caught completely off guard. Even though they would have been better prepared than in our timeline, it's unlikely that they would have been able to defeat the Germans and their allies. As such, the British Empire would have collapsed early on, leading to a swift German victory. With the British out of the picture, the Germans would have turned their attention to the Americans. Even though the U.S. would have put up a good fight, it's unlikely that they would have been able to defeat the Germans and their allies. As such, the Germans would have likely emerged victorious once again. During the post-war peace conference, the Germans would have demanded the complete dismantling of the U.S. and the seizure of all of its overseas territories. While the rest of the world would have been shocked at such blatant imperialism, there would have been little they could do to stop it. As such, the 20th century would have ended with the Germans controlling all of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, as well as significant parts of Asia. It's safe to say that this alternate timeline would have been a lot less fun for the Allies. But what about us here in the real world? Would our lives be better or worse in this alternate timeline? If you ask me, I think that life would have been worse for most people. Even though the Germans would have brought about greater technological advancements and economic prosperity to Europe, their brand of government would have been much more oppressive than that of the Allies. As such, the majority of the population would have lived in fear of the state. Moreover, the Germans would likely have expanded the scope of their empire even further. After all, there's no reason to believe that they would have stopped at the borders that were established in our timeline. As such, there's a good chance that the Germans would have conquered large parts of Asia and Australia as well. Ultimately, the Germans would have built the largest empire in the history of mankind. Under German rule, there's no doubt that life would have been terrible for those living in their empire. Slavery and genocide would have been rampant, and the overall quality of life would have been much lower than in our timeline. In fact, it's entirely possible that the Germans would have pursued an even more aggressive foreign policy than in our timeline, meaning that the atrocities of the past would have been nothing compared to those of this alternate world. So there you have it, to alternate histories in which the Germans either build the largest empire in human history or become the dominant power in Europe. Both of these scenarios are highly unlikely to have happened. But it's always fun to speculate about what could have been. Now over to you. Comment your thoughts below.